The Enlightenment brought forward grand ideas about natural rights and the equality of all people. But translating those high ideals into the messy reality of building actual nations is rarely a smooth process. By the late 18th century, the concepts of freedom and equality that fueled the American and French revolutions began reaching Latin America. They landed in colonies that were strictly divided and deeply unequal. At the very top of the social ladder sat the Peninsulares, temporary Spanish and Portuguese officials who controlled the colonial environment and drained the region's wealth. Directly below them were the Creoles. These were the wealthy, permanent descendants of Europeans. They controlled local land and business, and they deeply resented being locked out of top political positions by the Peninsulares. When Napoleon overthrew the monarchies of Spain and Portugal, the authority of those empires in their colonies began to slip. This political breakdown provided a window for radical change, leading to a sequence of revolutions between 1807 and 1825. The intellectual blueprint for freedom finally had its window of opportunity, and the clock officially started on Latin American independence. The first major break from Europe didn't happen on the mainland. It occurred in the Caribbean Sea, on the French sugar colony of Saint-Domingue. In 1791, François-Dominique Toussaint Louverture, a self-educated man born into slavery, organized more than 100,000 enslaved people on the island of Hispaniola into a massive, organized military uprising. In the United States and France, revolutionaries withheld natural rights from people without property, and the United States kept millions of people enslaved. The rebels in Saint-Domingue took the Enlightenment principles of freedom and equality to their logical conclusion, the complete and total abolition of slavery. By outlawing human bondage entirely, the lowest class of a brutal sugar colony proved they could defeat a European empire, proclaiming the independent nation of Haiti in 1804. 6 years later, the struggle for independence spread to North America. In 1810, a Catholic priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla began studying the French Revolution. He stepped up to his pulpit in the village of Dolores and issued a direct call for racial equality and the redistribution of stolen land. Hidalgo armed thousands of the local indigenous people, as well as the mestizos, people of mixed European and indigenous descent. His ill-equipped army was soon crushed by Spanish forces, and Hidalgo was sentenced to death. But the role of indigenous people and mestizos in the revolt frightened the Creoles and Peninsulares. Fearing the power of the masses, these conservative elites decided to cooperate and overthrow Spanish rule themselves. By 1821, Mexico was an independent republic, but it was led by the very Creole military leaders who had suppressed the earlier uprising. The transition of power ensured that while the Spanish were gone, the existing social order remained firmly in the hands of the wealthy. Further south, the push for independence required massive, continent-spanning military campaigns. Two members of the Creole elite, Simón Bolivar and José de San Martín, organized armies that systematically pushed Spanish authority out of places like Venezuela, Colombia, and Argentina. The logistical extremes of these wars were brutal. In 1817, San Martín marched his forces over the Andes Mountains. Soldiers pushed through freezing temperatures, suffering from oxygen deprivation more than 2 miles above sea level, just to surprise and defeat Spanish troops waiting in Chile. To protect these newly liberated states from European retaliation, U.S. President James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, warning against any recolonization. But the actual military shield enforcing that doctrine was the British Navy, which wanted to protect its new trading partners. By the end of 1824, nearly the entire map of South America was free of European empires. But as these populations were about to learn, fighting a war of independence is much easier than successfully building a nation. The wars left behind a staggering loss of life, destroyed property, and decimated livestock. This created a dangerous power vacuum. Because these new republics had zero practical experience with self-rule, they quickly fell under the control of Caudillos, military or political dictators who ruled chiefly by force. Some Caudillos were violently destructive and caused chaos, like Mexico's Santa Anna, whose disastrous rule led to the loss of nearly half of Mexico's territory to the United States. Others, like Benito Juárez, were popular reformers who separated church and state and built public education systems. Meanwhile, the wealthy landed elites maintained tight control over the local populations. Instead of growing basic food crops for a starving public, these massive estates relied on the export of a single cash crop, an agricultural product grown strictly to sell for profit overseas. Great Britain simply stepped in to replace Spain and Portugal as the dominant economic power. They established a cycle where Latin America exported cheap raw materials and was forced to import expensive finished consumer goods like textiles. This dynamic trapped the new republics. They had achieved political independence, but they remained entirely economically dependent on Western nations. Removing a European monarch was a heroic first step, but achieving true social equality, economic independence, and stable democracy would require generations of ongoing struggle.